All right. Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and faculty affiliate with the Iowa Learning Farms. And we are really fortunate to have Elizabeth Schwab with us today. Elizabeth is currently a research scientist with Iowa State University. Before that, she was a researcher that worked at The Ohio State University. And at one time in 2017, she reminded me it was 2017 that she was an intern with Iowa Learning Farms. So everything comes full circle in a way that now she's here to give a webinar. So we're really fortunate to have Elizabeth here with us. I'll introduce her topic in just a second. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to type those into the chat box and we'll get those to Elizabeth at the end of her talk. With that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to talk about visualizing drainage needs under a potential future climate. With that, Elizabeth, the virtual floor is all yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt. And thanks everyone for being here today. I'm excited to talk with everybody. So again, as Matt mentioned, this is some work that was completed right before I came to Iowa State, or came back to Iowa State, I should say. Sort of talking about how do we visualize what drainage needs might be not only now, but in the future. And so this work was inspired by a need for providing more resources to support extension presentations. So I was involved with extension and outreach work at Ohio State. And so I'll give you a little bit of an outline and sort of the background, approach, methods, the results, but really what I want to focus on is how are these results being used? Because again, this was developed for extension outreach presentations, and I always think it's really interesting to think about not just the work that we do, but in which situations is it being applied? And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. So a bit of this background. So I was working with the Drainage Education and Research Program at Ohio State. And so a big topic was thinking about, of course, water management needs, and water management needs not only now, but how can we be adaptable into the future? So thinking about those future climate projections for Ohio and the Midwest at large, generally speaking, we're going to be seeing warmer and wetter winters and springs, while our summers will be hotter and drier. And so, of course, we know that when we have changing climate, changing weather patterns, we're going to need to change the way that we manage water everywhere, and especially in our agricultural landscapes, to make sure that we're able to provide or to continue producing crops as we have previously. So we're thinking about Ohio, but an area of the state that we do a lot of research work, do a lot of extension and outreach work is Northwest Ohio, which is some of the best, most productive agricultural lands, but also some very, very poorly drained soils. So you can see in that top graphic there, we've got Northwest Ohio is that dark blue, that poorly drained and very poorly drained soils. And then if you look at the graphic below that, that's the area drained by artificial subsurface tile. And so again, we've got that dark blue, meaning that there's an awful lot of tile drained land in Northwest Ohio. So again, poorly drained soils, we're thinking about tile drainage and drainage water management decisions. So sort of what prompted this work was more interest among farmers in either intensifying current drainage systems. So thinking about if they already had 40-foot drain spacing, should they be increasing that to 20-foot drain spacing, splitting those tile laterals? Or if you don't already have drainage installed, should we be thinking about installing drainage at narrower spacing? Because we're seeing these seasonal water dynamics. Farmers are already seeing these changing weather patterns that right now are sort of manifesting themselves as wetter springs, which we know we're going to be expecting now into the future, right? And so that poses an issue because we've got some critical periods when we're thinking about crop growth. Planting, of course, falls in that spring period where we're thinking about, I need to be able to get into the field, but also it's a lot wetter during this time of year now. So we're thinking about how do we make water management decisions that will allow us to get into the field when we need to for timely planting to ensure that we've got that timely crop growth, enough time for that. But we also know that planting isn't the only time when we care about what's happening in the field. We're also thinking about the growing season and harvest periods. And while we know that we're seeing, maybe not so much quite yet, we're not as worried about drier summers in Ohio, but thinking into the future, we definitely need to be considering the fact that we might be seeing even less water than we currently are in the future. And well, that's not great timing, right? Because we need that water for our crops to grow in the summer. So the question here is sort of how do we balance our water management needs so that we can be successful under both wet conditions and dry conditions? So that's sort of what motivated this work, is thinking about what suggestions, what resources can we provide to help guide farmers to make decisions. We don't want to make decisions for anybody, but we want to empower them to make their own decisions and provide them with the resources to do so. So what are our communication needs? Again, I mentioned previously, this is driven by a need to provide resources for extension audiences. So these audiences are non-technical audiences and farmers largely. So we need to think about how are we presenting that information in a way that's appealing to those audiences, that's appropriate for those audiences. And there's some things we need to keep in mind, because while we are talking about future climate scenarios, we don't really want to use the term climate change. That's a controversial term. Best to avoid that. And sort of in line with that, climate projection models are confusing. Even me, as somebody who works in agriculture, works in the sciences, it's confusing for me to hear things about, in the X number of years in the future, we'll be seeing an average of 1 degree Celsius increase, or whatever the case may be for that future climate projection. That's hard for me to conceptualize. That's hard for most people to conceptualize, I think. So the ability to visualize what we're talking about is really important. So again, this sort of overarching question, this overarching need that we're addressing is how can we effectively communicate the potential impacts of climate change on future water management needs? So I'll turn here to some of the strategies that are proven throughout the literature, throughout extension-focused resources, thinking about what are those suggestions that they have for having the best communications when it comes to climate change and agricultural audiences. So we're thinking about facilitating dialogue. With whatever approach we choose, we want to make sure that we're creating opportunities to have that conversation, making openings for people to go in and say, okay, this makes sense to me. Here's some of that dialogue that we can have moving forward. We want to make sure that we're connecting the issue to audience values. So thinking about, of course, in this case, we're thinking about water management, agricultural audiences, thinking about how do we grow crops profitably, and sustainably now and into the future. And finally, we want to think about, rather, again, shifting away from that climate change focused mindset, but thinking about the conditions that we're already experiencing, that we're already familiar with. This variability in weather, these extreme weather events that we're seeing, that we've seen in the past, that we might be seeing more frequently now and again into the future. And then thinking about those concrete next steps. So what are the actions that we can take that will help us be more resilient now and in the future when it comes to water management? So what is the approach that we've taken in this work? So again, sort of starting out by relating the projected future climate in Ohio to current climatic conditions in other states. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But ultimately, we're thinking about how do we visualize, how do we make the effects of climate change more salient to our audiences? Then we went through some simulations to show how seasonal and annual trends in water might change under these hypothetical future climate scenarios. And ultimately, the goal is to use this information to empower farmers to make informed water management decisions, to do what's right for them. So as far as that visualization goes, you can see the graphic on the right, which is a graphic that we've used a lot in extension presentations in the past, thinking about how the future climate of Ohio compares to current climates elsewhere. And so my group didn't develop this. It's something that was a collaboration between NOAA and the University of Michigan and Michigan State University, where they've developed these sort of, they call them migrating climates or shifting states models, where we're looking at current conditions in the state, which again, in this case is Ohio, and then looking at future climate projections. So this is a document that they used, future climate projections for the year 2030 and 2095, and then looking for present day analogs to those conditions. So thinking about when they did this analysis, looking at, okay, here's the projection for Ohio in the year 2095. What's a state that right now has those current conditions? And so ultimately what this analysis found is that we might be expecting by the end of the century for Ohio summers to feel more like present day Arkansas summers, and for winters to be shifting to the southeast towards that Virginia, North Carolina area. So again, this is a graphic that's proven to be very well received because it clearly shows, I might not know what a change of a couple degrees looks like or will feel like, but I know that, summers are already hot. I really don't want it to be like summer in Arkansas, that's kind of yucky. But I can see from that, well, clearly they must be managing crops very differently in Arkansas to be able to survive those hotter conditions. And so it just gives a starting point for people to be able to visualize, okay, this is what we need to be thinking forward to in the future. We need to make decisions that will help serve us not only now, but by the end of the century, where it's essentially like we're farming in a totally different state. So that's the starting point for our analysis. And ultimately, the goal was to model current and future performance of drainage systems in Ohio using historic Ohio weather data as well as weather data for those representative states from the slide that I showed previously to create current Ohio and future Ohio scenarios that will allow us to see how water table dynamics might play out in these drained landscapes and thinking about what decisions we want to make in the future. So brief overview of the methods. Again, this is just really quick. So we use DrainMod to simulate that water table hydrology in these tile drained landscapes. We ran this for a 30-year simulation period, so from the early 90s to the early 2020s. We selected Hoytville clay loam soils as a soil that's common in Northwest Ohio because, again, that's sort of a salient region. That's a region of focus for a lot of our research and outreach work. For simplicity, we used a continuous corn rotation. And then the scenarios, as I described previously, are 40-foot drain spacings, which might be a sort of standard drain spacing, and comparing that to that narrower, that more intense drainage, those 20-foot drain spacings. And again, those weather scenarios that we selected for our current Ohio scenario, we have a county in Northwest Ohio, and so we used historical winter, spring, summer, and fall weather from Allen County. And then for that future Ohio scenario, essentially what we did is we selected 2 centrally located counties in these states. So we have Guilford County, North Carolina, and Pulaski County, Arkansas for the winter and summer weather respectively. Again, because we wanted this to align with that shifting states graphic that I showed a couple slides ago. So we're connecting that visual with what we did in our simulation. And then for right now, we use the spring and fall weather to be the same as in our current Ohio scenario. So again, this is a very simple simulation, but ultimately we wanted to use that to provide some outputs to pair with that shifting states graphic and use that as a springboard for conversations around water management. So I'm going to quickly go through the results. We're not going to dwell too much on the numbers because, as I just mentioned, this was a simplified simulation. And in the future, if this work were to continue, I think we would definitely be more meticulous in perhaps the parameters that we were selecting to represent these future climate scenarios. But for now, I'll just talk about the trends in our results. And so we can see here, we're comparing that 40-foot drain spacing to the 20-foot drain spacing. We see that under current climate conditions, we're seeing more drainage discharge under that narrower spacing, which makes sense because we've got more drains, we're able to pull that water table down more rapidly. Under future Ohio scenarios, same trend applies there. But of course, we have less drainage discharge as a consequence of higher temperatures, maybe a mismatch in timing of precipitation, crop water management needs, but ultimately there's less drainage discharge under that future Ohio scenario, the future climate scenario. And so another way that we visualize these results is looking at them broken out monthly, and we've pulled out some of the summer months as well in this sort of zoomed in graph to the right of each. And again, sort of a similar trend where we're looking at the differences between 40-foot spacing and 20-foot spacing, and we're seeing less drainage discharge throughout most months of the year in that future Ohio scenario. And again, when you really zoom in on those summer months, because those are the months that we're interested in for crop production, we're seeing much less discharge during those summer months. Again, as a combination of factors, we've got decreased precipitation, but also increased evapotranspiration because we have a growing crop there, and increased crop water uptake. So number of days with tile flow, we've got more days with tile flow under the current scenario compared to the future scenario, as we would expect. And again, comparing that 40-foot drain spacing to the 20-foot drain spacing, we see more days with tile flow under the wider drain spacing because we're drawing that water table down less rapidly with that less intense drainage system. Monthly number of days with tile flow, once again, we can see those comparisons there throughout the year and between the spacings, between that current and future scenarios. And we're seeing, in the summer months especially, we're seeing much fewer days with tidal flow occurring in the summer, and even fewer days under those future Ohio scenarios. Average water table depth is the last parameter that we'll be talking about here, because these are sort of the three parameters that we're really using in our presentations to hit those important talking points and foster future discussions. So that annual average water table depth, again, that water table drawdown is greater for that more intense drain spacing. And water table depth, lower, so farther below the soil surface in the future climate scenario compared to current. Again, we've got those results shown visually, and we'll revisit these as I move further into the presentation. But really quick, an overview summary, which we've already sort of talked through, but under this hypothetical future climate scenario, so compared to our current Ohio conditions, our future conditions will have lower discharge under both drain spacing and even less during the summer month, again, as a consequence of these higher temperatures, projected lower precipitation, and increased crop water uptake. We'll have fewer days with tidal flow and a deeper depth to water table. So clearly, we've put a lot of focus into these summer months because that's what we're thinking about for crop production. We really need to be thinking about water management for drought stress. And so one of the big points that we like to hit on in these extension presentations, because we are often focused on not only water management for profitability, but for the environmental side of it as well. So thinking about what conservation drainage practices can be applicable in these future climate scenarios. And finally, again, how are we communicating these findings? And that's what I'll transition into now, is sort of taking these results that we've showed quickly here and how we're incorporating them into presentations to have these conversations with farmers and with our extension audiences. So how do we do that? Sort of three main points here, starting out by using this sort of shifting states or migrating climates, however you want to think about it, model as a talking point to understand how and why we might need to change our water management strategies in the future. Then we can use these simulation results that I've just shared with you to illustrate seasonal trends in water dynamics, and then move forward by discussing the potential future impacts of intensifying drainage. And so again, this sort of lays the groundwork to talk about conservation drainage practices and how they might be applicable in certain situations. So I have some example presentation slides courtesy of the team at Ohio State and Vinayak Shetkar. So again, I've sort of condensed much larger presentations down into just a handful of slides that I really feel like hit on these important points of these are the ways that we're communicating these messages. So starting out by showing that migrating climates model, hitting on that point of the extreme and unpredictable weather patterns that we're seeing, things that farmers can connect with, things that farmers have already experienced and have already proven to be capable of sort of adapting to and thinking about strategies for overcoming them. Again, pointing out what we might be expecting by the end of the century, and sort of using this again as a starting point for people to think about, okay, clearly things need to change. We've already seen these changes in the weather patterns. If they continue into the future, what are we going to need to be doing differently? Providing those talking points here. So thinking again about the implications of both too much water and too little water, because we've seen that we have both of these issues, right? We're seeing these water springs. We're beginning to see these drier summers. Drier summers, of course, it's a period where we have too little water, and that's a time when we need that water for crop growth. Whereas the winter, spring, when we have too much water, there's that mismatch in timing of precipitation. And so what are some of the consequences of that? Again, we can use that to talk through that. Today, I'm not going to read through all the details of each of these slides because, again, I really want to present this broad overview. I'm talking about how we can deal with these issues. So in the case of too much water, we can think about changes to our crop varieties, or as is the point for a drainage and a drainage-focused extension program, thinking about what changes we can make to our drainage systems. So in the case of too much water, and we've talked about this already, we might think about improving or intensifying current drainage systems to move that water faster during times where it needs to get off the field. But on the other hand, in periods of too little water, we want to be controlling that drainage water loss, or we want to be having less intensive drainage systems. So there are a number of practices that are available to us, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we continue the conversation on those things. But I just want to highlight, we can then transition into, okay, here are some of the strategies that we might take as far as water management goes. And then here, moving back into these slides that you've seen me show previously, these graphics where we're really highlighting those changes in the summer where we have those drier conditions, and comparing and contrasting that 40-foot spacing to that 20-foot spacing, because again, our goal is not to tell people what to do, but it's to allow them to make informed decisions with additional knowledge about a variety of practices or options that are available to them. Coming back to this water table depth graphic, we can use this to really illustrate, and again, this is something that would be talked about for more than just a few seconds in one of these presentations, but for today, since we're coming close to the end of my time already, we'll just talk a little bit about the fact we're showing this graphic up here above the tile drain depth. So our tile drain depth is simulated as 3 feet depth. So any water above that in a regular free drainage system will be draining that water. And we can see we have similar water table drawdown during these winter, early spring months, but that water table drawdown is greater in the summer months, in these months of greatest crop water need under that future Ohio scenario. So just using that once again, highlighting those results in these presentations. We've got that boxed out again for the 40-foot spacing compared to the 20-foot spacing. The previous slide was just 40-foot spacing. But again, we can have conversation about these comparisons here. And then transitioning into those conclusions, or I don't really want to say conclusions, but maybe further discussion after we've shown those results, after we've talked about these potential future climate scenarios that we'll be in. And so, for example, here we're seeing that for the Hoytville soil, we did run this for other soil series, but this is just the one that this presentation focused on. So we can see that both 40 and 20-foot spacing, drain spacing has similar effects on current water table drawdown, but in the future, under both spacings, we'll have greater summer water table drawdown. And furthermore, as I discussed previously when we talked about results, tiles are going to be flown only for a few days in those summer months, and under 20-foot spacing, those will be flown for even fewer days. So there's even less excess moisture under those scenarios. So will that intensified drainage be helpful in the future? Maybe no, maybe yes. It really depends on where you want to go with that. Under certain conditions, it might be better. Under certain other ones. But we also want to think about going beyond just this regular free drainage system to really open the floor for conversations about conservation drainage or multifunctional drainage systems. So for example, if you have narrower drain spacing, that might be a good candidate for pairing that with drainage water recycling and thinking about sub-irrigation. And I'll talk about that on our next couple of slides, since I know I'm running short on time here. We'll sort of transition into some of the practices that we talk about as a follow-up to just our discussion of what things look like under these regular free drainage situations under potential future climate, and what conservation drainage practices might we pair with these decisions to help us adapt to what we expect to see under future climate scenarios. So one of the practices that we can talk about is drainage water management, or controlled drainage, where we're thinking about, rather than letting these systems drain freely throughout the year, so keep that water table at that 3-foot depth, we can think about during times where we don't need to be removing off that water, because of course when we're removing that water, it's gone downstream and it's carrying with it some nutrients as well. And so when we're thinking on the sort of nutrient management side of things, water quality side of things, it's advantageous to keep that water in the field whenever possible. So if we're thinking about controlled drainage, we can think about putting in structures that enable us to keep that water table higher during times of year like winter and early spring, when it doesn't matter if the field's wet because we're not growing a cash crop there. But having the ability to lower that water table when we need to get into the field for planting and harvest, maybe managing that water table during the summer months to keep more water when we can, when it's present in the summer months, when we know that we're going to be water stressed into the future. So any water that we can hold back, we want to be retaining that if possible. So offering this up as one option, one sort of point for discussion, again, is that controlled drainage. And we can talk more about the potential benefits to crop yield of implementing controlled drainage systems. We can talk about, again, that water quality benefit, as well as the water quantity benefits that I've just sort of glossed over right here, giving you the 15-second overview. I briefly touched on drainage water recycling, or the idea of capturing water from surface and, in this case, subsurface drainage systems, pumping that to a sort of pond or wetland, some kind of reservoir where we can hold that water, and then we can use it to either pump it back through the existing subsurface drainage system to provide irrigation water to crops, or applying it through overhead irrigation of some sort, or surface irrigation. And again, we can use this as an opportunity to talk about the benefits of drainage water recycling, thinking about, for example, if you are choosing to put in that narrower drain spacing, you're implementing a system that would be a good candidate for sub-irrigation. Again, pending a number of conditions, but it is one option that could potentially be available to you. And so just showing here some more graphics, another slide that I pulled from that larger presentation, just showing the different irrigation options with that drainage water recycling option. And then we can transition again. All of these slides have that sort of associated research in Northwest Ohio. So research findings from these kind of systems. And again, talking about the yield impacts, water quantity, and water quality impacts from these different practices. So that's all I have for today. I think I'm about at my time, but I hope that this was at least one aspect of this was interesting to you in some way. I think that this is a really great opportunity to think about how do we integrate graphics? How do we integrate simple scenarios, use that to create outputs that allow us to have these talking points, these springboards into future conversations around conservation in agriculture. So I'd like to thank you for your time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great. And yeah, you were right on time. So thank you for that. And I think it really gives us lots to think about because, like you said, we aren't telling somebody what to do, but hopefully starting that conversation. So we will have time for some questions. We've gotten a couple in already, but before we get to that, let's go to the next couple slides. Okay, so if you are on today and need a CCA CEU, want to earn that, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW @iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Enter your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, Elena, ALENAW @iastate.edu. Next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one survey response for 2024 webinars is needed. So if you've done so, thank you very much. If not, if you're willing, that would be great. You can go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey or scan the QR code. And then just to put a plug in for, I think, the next slide is next week's webinar. We have Pete Moore discussing phosphorus exchanges between a river and its floodplain. I'm bummed I'm going to be gone and miss that, but please tune in to hear Dr. Pete Moore on phosphorus exchanges between a river and its floodplain. With that, Elizabeth, we have gotten some questions. First one is, again, well, it's kind of on the climate change topic, but what words or phrases do you use when talking to farmers on these topics that are a little more controversial like that?
So I will preface this by saying that these are presented, ultimately, since this is work that was completed sort of right before I left Ohio State, I don't want to take any credit for having actually given these presentations because this is just me sharing the work that my collaborators have done since then. But I will say one of the most important things that we try to focus on is, so again, not using the phrase climate change, but really talking about those weather extremes, those freak storms, those really wet springs that we had that one year or whatever, giving people opportunities to talk about, oh, this year was really bad and this is what I did to overcome the challenges that I experienced. So really just thinking about it in terms of what are the weather patterns that we've been seeing? What are some examples of times where it's been harder to farm than it maybe has been in the past? I'm not sure if that fully addressed the question, but that's sort of been the springboard for having these conversations, just sort of thinking about times when we've had these challenges.
Yeah. There are a couple somewhat related questions in here about, kind of how, this was for Ohio, excuse me, you're in Iowa now and I'm in Iowa, but for Ohio. And would there be, I guess, how specific might some of these results be to Ohio? Or, do you see a need for trying to do maybe similar type simulations across the region to kind of across the Corn Belt as we think about maybe from Minnesota to Ohio, to think about how we might see how they might compare and contrast in some of the seasonality of some of these shifts?
Mhm. I definitely think that there's a lot of potential to continue this work. As I did mention briefly, this was a very simple simulation because it would be really unrealistic for me to say that the entire state of Ohio will look exactly like this. Just like our selection of the counties in the representative states, there's a lot of variation across the state of Arkansas, for example. And so in looking for that present day analog, I think further work should really hone in on which specific locations within the state that we want to focus on. Because you could be, for example, looking far northwest Ohio, that's very different than far south Ohio, as far as topography, as far as climatic influences. And so there's definitely a need to be more nuanced in the simulations if we want to feel really confident in the numbers that we're presenting. Ultimately, we chose this approach to sort of look at trends. But if we wanted to say that our results were really specific to a location, we couldn't do that right now.
Yeah, great. That I would tend to agree. And there was a question about, if ET was of other states was brought in, but really you were looking at Ohio, and there might be kind of maybe something for the Conservation Drainage Network to think about. How could we do, similar type simulations across the Corn Belt? Because I'd be really interested how some of these, timing of drainage might change, because we all might have wetter springs and drier summers, but because of the type of natural patterns we have now when we get drainage. I know in Ohio you get a lot more winter drainage than we do in Iowa, for example. And so all right, the next one is, what was the source of Ohio's future climate? They indicated they believe they're based on the GCM simulation outputs.
So the future climate simulations, now I will say that the document that we got them from is from a collaboration between NOAA and the University of Michigan and Michigan State University. And then there was an additional publication that came out from the Bird Polar Climate Research Center at Ohio State University. And I did reach out to them and ask them for further detail, and I never heard back. So I don't have the exact methods that they used for that particular graphic and for that particular simulation, but if anybody's interested in contacting me in the future, I can pass along the resources that I do have that I've referenced in putting this together, and I'm happy to share with you everything that I have.
Okay. Next one is, how have you considered intense rainfall events as opposed to cumulative seasonal or monthly rainfall?
So looking, I guess pulling out any specific events and looking at
they might want to
hydrology associated with those events.
Yeah, they might want to, if there's something specific, they might want to maybe type in a little bit more, because I'm thinking drain mod, you put in daily precipitation, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, so we put in 30 years of precipitation data for those simulations. Okay. And so if we were thinking about a hypothetical scenario where if you were interested in, say, what might happen under these temperature conditions and these X, Y, and Z conditions when we received 5 inches of precipitation on a given day, that is a simulation that could be done, but it would need to be manually created. Right now, we actually use historic weather records to construct these simulations. And so unless there was a day where that event you were interested in happened, I couldn't pull out something like that.
Next one was, where do we find the shifting states models? Yeah, I found that one really interesting and useful for extension type presentations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is, everybody's interested in this. Okay. And I wish I could tell you that there's one of these out there for every state.
Okay.
That is not the case. I have been able to dig up a couple different resources. So ultimately, some of these simulations came from a Great Lakes focused project. And so, which is why we've been privileged to have something like this existing for Ohio. But there are these sort of migrating climates visualizations available for several Great Lakes states. I don't know of any other ones. Again, I'm happy if people contact me. I'm happy to send you to the right place. I don't know off the top of my head, what you should Google to get there. But really, there are also a couple papers that were written that give more details about how these graphics were created. So it is something that if you had partners who were savvy with climate modeling and data visualization, you might want to consider working with you, because I already know that this is something that I'm really interested in. I wish there was something like this for Iowa now. now that I'm in Iowa, I wish we had something like this. And so figuring out who the right people to contact are to get one of them for yourself would be nice.
Yeah, they
But
might
hopefully I
not
can
be.
pass along resources that will help facilitate that conversation.
Okay, that might be something we could talk about sometime. Maybe the Midwest Climate Hub that's located here, that might be something they could help with. I don't know if any of them are on. Sometimes they are, but that might be a topic. Couple more questions. Do you see any applications of your research for perennial crops like nuts and fruits?
To be perfectly honest, I know much less about specialty crop production. I think that there's certainly benefit in looking at those water table dynamics, even if you're not taking it to that next step. Again, we use this research. This was really driven by the desire to have sort of simulation outputs to be paired with that migrating states graphic.
Okay.
To have a way of saying, okay, this is what we expect future climates to look like. This is what we expect the drainage systems, how we expect drainage systems to perform and what that might mean for water management. So in that case, these simulation outputs, again, are for these tile drained landscapes. So if you're working in systems where it's not tile drained, then this isn't the best way of looking at it. But that being said, if you are working in these artificially drained landscapes, this is an approach that you could definitely look at, if for no other reason than to just look at what are the water table dynamics and how are they projected to change under future scenarios, and thinking about, are there changes that you could make to your management, even if you're on a small scale operation, where the reality might be that you're never going to adopt any of the practices that I talked about at the end of my presentation, but just thinking about what decisions you might be able to make more informed water management decisions.
Okay, another one here. Oh, has any work been done with 30-foot drain spacing, or would this be figured as kind of the difference between the 20 and 40?
So we didn't specifically run a scenario for 30-foot spacing. It would be very quick and easy to do it if we wanted to do it. But ultimately what we decided to do was really, again, this work was driven by people's questions about, should we be considering splitting existing laterals? So a lot of people have around 40-foot drain spacing. So if we split that, that would be 20-foot spacing. And so that's really why we had these two particular compare and contrast scenarios. It was thinking about, okay, here's sort of the current free drainage scenario. Here's a more intense drainage scenario that represents what we might see if farmers are considering splitting that tile drain spacing.
Okay, double check here. I think we got most of these. All right. Again, Elizabeth, thank you so much. And thank you for being willing to, have people contact you if they have specific questions.
I can put my email address back
Okay,
up
yeah,
too,
if you just put that
that
back
would
up,
be
that'd be
helpful.
great. Yep. Awesome. And again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Alena Whitaker, ALENAW @iastate.edu. By 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, tune in next week to see Dr. Pete Moore. And I think that if nothing else, you raised a lot of really important points that some of us in the drainage area think need to be looked at more, and kind of doing some similar modeling to how you did across the Corn Belt, because it might help us as we talk to many different individuals, kind of how things are similar or different as we look across the Corn Belt. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you everybody for attending. I'll give Elizabeth the last word.
Well, thanks everyone.
Yep.
That's all I have to say. I just appreciate
Okay.
you spending time with me.